Capitalism, anti-capitalism, climate change, system change. These are not small topics, but they are the combined focus of this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello, and welcome to PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as a participatory economy. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. I am joined by two folks. One, Robin Hahnel.
Good to be with you today.
And joining us as well from Helsinki, Finland, is Antti Jauhiainen.
Yeah, great to be here.
And we have a very big topic that we're going to be talking about. And Robin has been working on a paper related to this. It is a very broad topic involving capitalism, anti-capitalism, climate change, and system change. And Robin, since you've been working on a paper talking about these very topics, which are very broad and which have a lot of intersections, can you narrow this down a bit and also explain what you're writing about in the context about this? What's going on?
Well, I mean, I've written about these issues for, going on 20 years now, but the American Economic Association has annual meetings in January every year, and I'm both presenting a paper and chairing a panel on this subject at the meetings that are going to take place in January down in San Antonio, Texas. So I've been once again revisiting this issue and trying to figure out how to talk about it with people. And what I've done is I basically said, well, let's formulate some questions. And the first question would be, well, is global neoliberal capitalism on track to trigger catastrophic and possibly irreversible climate change? And the answer to that one is clearly yes. If you listen to climate scientists, they have been warning us about this, and every warning is more dire. Yes. Are there climate denialists? Is the fossil fuel industry still, attempting to convince us otherwise? Yes. But slowly and surely, the tide has been turning in public opinion on this subject. Well, the second question is, well, must growth of economic well-being cease in order to avert environmental disaster? And on the left and in the climate movement, there is something called the steady state people and degrowth people. And that's their argument. They say they recognize the impending disaster, and they draw the conclusion that economic growth of well-being really has to cease in order to avert this disaster. And my argument is that is absolutely not true. It is not the case. And it's very debilitating to tell people that, because I think that's a program, that's impossible to sell politically. Now, another question is there some alternative economic system which would allow economic well-being to flourish indefinitely while also adequately protecting the natural environment? And my answer to that is yes. And in fact, after making changes and adding features to the model of a participatory economy in order to accomplish exactly that, I think we have a very good proposal that does clearly demonstrate that it's possible to reconcile, environmental protection with continued indefinite economic growth of well-being for humanity. And then the fourth question is, well, so is the solution to climate change to replace capitalism with this system? And my argument is that it would be nice if we could do that in the next decade. But I think it's fairly clear that we are a decade or more away from replacing global capitalism with anything that's sort of with a more desirable system. And so that isn't the solution to climate change. But I think we're still fortunate that even while most countries have capitalist economies, if we act decisively now, it's still possible to avert cataclysmic climate change before it's too late. But that's a difficult task. And, that requires successful international negotiations. It requires countries like the United States launching, Green New Deals. And it requires even state governments, pursuing policies until those other things have happened, that start moving us very, very quickly and rapidly in the right direction. So that has been my take on this issue for a long time now. But there's a lot of controversy out there, particularly on the left at the moment, with regard to these issues.
And quite a lot to cover over. Antti, having heard the summary of the argument by Robin, sounds like you probably wouldn't dispute that, but what are your thoughts in light of what Robin just mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think it's what we ought to be discussing is, I think, how can we achieve a system where growth of human well-being is compatible with protection of nature? And I think it's sort of a sideshow philosophical debate on, is growth possible, is indefinite growth possible on a finite planet, which is the slogan that's been used, Robin knows better, but maybe even in the 60s, but at least in the 70s, that was already used. And arguing about it sort of becomes this, what I don't like is that it becomes this sort of contest that some people say that growth isn't possible anymore. Then other people say that no, growth is possible. And then it sort of sidesteps, for example, what is realistic currently. And of course, that always changes depending on the situation. And leftists are always eager to remind all of us that all systems we see are built by humans, and therefore humans can rebuild them. But that doesn't mean it's possible, because these systems have been built, in the span of centuries. The kind of, industrial framework we have currently for human sort of economies, and changing that overnight. I mean, I'm happy if there is a way, but I certainly don't see it. And I've been thinking about this for 20 years basically. Instead, I think when it comes to Robin's 4 points in your article, I think the main thing is that we should be talking more about how inefficient and how much of a failure capitalism is. I think that should be, honestly, the focus of much more discussion. A lot of movements like environmental movements and so on, we see, or labor movements, are often portrayed by those on the right as being anti-capitalist. And when that happens, a lot of those movements are way too eager to jump to say, no, we aren't anti-capitalist. We only want fair rights for workers. Or no, we're not anti-capitalist. We only wish to protect nature. I think there is enough evidence, even in the mainstream economics, that capitalism simply isn't a good economic system. Saying that doesn't mean we should change everything, instantly. But I think it's an important starting point, recognizing that. And I think the growth discussion might dangerously sidestep that. When the focus comes on growth, it becomes this, is growth possible, isn't it possible? Whereas just stating that it's becoming more and more obvious that capitalism is a failed economic system, and we must find ways to construct an economic system that is compatible with, growth, and that is compatible, or human well-being, and is compatible with environmental protection. Of course, I think that there is a system that can achieve those goals. And of course, I'm waving the flag of participatory economy here. But I think in more general terms, the idea of democratic planning is something that is needed in the field, because that's the one way to start moving forward from where we currently are, which is basically just saying that how much does capitalism suck, or is growth possible or not? And it's sort of not going anywhere because, like Robin said, I think the right wing also commentators are right on this. That as long as we have capitalism, and as an avowed anti-capitalist, I'm willing to say that we are going to have capitalism for quite some time.
Couple of weeks at least.
Yeah, a couple of weeks at least, depending on our choices. But the thing is that we have to find ways because doing a collapse of growth within capitalism is just terribly disastrous for especially those people who are less well off, especially in the kind of situation we currently have when we don't have international systems, the kind of systems we had after Second World War, where we could allocate resources between countries efficiently to support poorer countries and so on. We have a really tense international situation between West and then, Russia, China, and so on. In that kind of situation, it could get like dangerously theoretical, and in many ways, I'm not willing to say useless, but I think it's a sideshow of what is really happening in the world, and the growth discussion might take from that. Yeah.
On the topic of growth, it seems like I'd like to explore this a little bit more with both of you. That it seems like it's more of I want to get more into why it's controversial. I mean, I can understand why, because they think that capitalism, particularly neoliberal capitalism, very much is based on growth, but yet it would be understandable, especially given the first premise of what Robin had mentioned earlier, that a neoliberal capitalism system, which includes growth, would be bad, not only be bad, but be perhaps catastrophically destructive regarding the environment for reasons we can get into. But it's the growth point, especially why thinking like growth itself is not necessarily, since it's part of a bad system, it itself is also bad. Maybe that's why I think this is such a controversial sticking point. Am I on the right track here? Robin, what do you think?
No, I think that the first question you need to ask is growth of what exactly?
Right.
And part of the problem is that there's a tremendous amount of sloppy thinking that goes on that subject. And while some of the leaders of the ecological economics movement, they're responsible for both two things. The one thing they're responsible for that was very, very helpful was they're the ones that created this concept called environmental throughput. Mm-hmm. And environmental throughput is inputs from the natural environment. It can be oil, it can be coal, it can be fertile land, it can be, board feet of timber. And when we produce things, you need inputs from the natural environment. And so they call this environmental throughput. And what we do is we take human labor and we work with environmental throughput, and we produce goods and services as output. And so when you think about it that way, you say, well, wait a second. If more and more people on the planet keep producing more and more output, well, then that means that we're going to be using more and more environmental throughput, and it is a finite planet, and we're going to run out of resources. I mean, originally it was, if you go back to the 1960s, it was the Club of Rome study that was concentrating on, we're going to run out of natural resources, if we keep doing what we're doing. And that's true. If we keep doing what we're doing, we are going to run out of natural resources. Now, the irony for the original sort of environmental alarm bells about where the economy was taking us, They were concerned more with inputs from the natural environment. Remember, peak oil was going to bring civilization to a halt.
Yep.
We don't hear too much about peak oil anymore because it turns out we're going to run out of something else first that's going to bring civilization to a halt.
This very book, The Long Emergency, was predicated by James Howard Kunstler, was predicated on that very point.
That's right.
Dunking peak oil in 2015.
That's right. So the original alarm bells were we're going to run out of inputs from the natural environment if we continue to run our economies the way we've been running them. Ironically, it turned out that the problem that came up first was the opposite end, which is when we engage in production, we not only use inputs from the natural environment, we release waste products back into the natural environment. And the one that's about to doom us are the greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
So at this point, the alarm bells should be going off about the first disaster that kills you rather than the third or the fourth disaster that would kill you. And that is greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. The problem is that economic throughput is not the same as economic well-being. Economic well-being is how much well-being do we get, out of whatever labor hours we engage in. And just as you can have technological changes that increase labor productivity, you can have technological changes that improve the efficiency of using environmental throughput. And I've proved this theorem, and it's been published in a peer-reviewed economic journal, which says, well, just at the basic logical level, if new technologies improve environmental throughput, increase the efficiency of environmental throughput as fast as new technologies increase the efficiency of labor, well, then you have growth of well-being of what you're producing without putting any extra strain on the natural environment. And this sort of fundamental error in logic is something that plagues the sort of core of the degrowth and the steady state movements. They equate economic growth of well-being with necessarily increasing environmental throughput. Now, they're right about the fact that we have been doing that. The reason we have an environmental crisis is because technological change that improves the efficiency of environmental throughput has not been keeping pace with technological change that improves the efficiency of labor. We clearly have an environmental crisis, so it's clearly a fact of how things have unfolded that, that the thing that needs to happen has not been happening. That's simply saying that we have an environmental crisis that we're faced with. But there is a solution. In the short run, the solution is, well, even within capitalism, with all of the dynamics that capitalism entails, even within capitalism, is it still too late to avert the impending disaster, which is climate change? And I think there's good reason to believe that we should not give up on that. And one of the things that I really worry about is leftists tend to preach, well, we're doomed unless we have system change. And then you ask an ordinary person, well, and how fast is that likely to come about? And the answer is, well, they know it's not going to come about for 10 to 20 years at a bare minimum. And so then you just get a kind of fatalistic despondency. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's interesting is that, well, forget capitalism for a moment. If we redesign a different economic system, well, is degrowth necessary in that case too? If you design an economic system that actually achieves environmental, is it impossible to design an economic system that achieves environmental sustainability and also continues to grow economic well-being for the average person indefinitely? And the answer to that is it's perfectly possible. And yet almost anybody who is a member or a spokesperson for or an adherent to the degrowth movement, they don't believe that's possible. And if it's not possible to increase economic well-being for humanity, then what are you going to tell the residents of the third world? And what are you going to tell the bottom 40%, of the income distribution in Europe and the United States? You're going to tell them that they should just give up any hope, for an improvement in their living standards because that's impossible to reconcile with saving the environment. It's not impossible to reconcile. Even in the short run, we can avert climate change still while capitalism persists if we do a whole bunch of things that are very, very difficult and require all of us to participate in, including those on the left, who my big problem is, if you're on the left and you're sort of standing on the sidelines and saying, I'm not going to pitch in to try and prevent climate change because it's pointless until we replace the capitalist economic system, well, then you've become part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I also think it's also a death knell for the left to do that, because I think people are not going to follow a movement that basically takes that stand on this really quintessential issue of humanity that stands before us.
In light of what Robin just said, Antti, any thoughts to share?
Yeah, I was thinking that one of the things that, especially in uncertain times, inspires people. Well, it's another thing what inspires a lot of activists, but it inspires people in general is certainty and something that you can sort of trust that things are going in some direction. Things are progressing. We are going forward, and that's why I think degrowth has a lot of inspiring aspects to it, starting with the sort of general, I think, sensible idea that we can't be always wasting stuff. That's been part of environmental movements sort of shtick for a long time, and for a good reason. I think that's what resonates with a lot of people. But when it comes to system change, I don't think it works precisely for reasons that Robin mentioned, especially if you don't have an actual sort of degrowth endpoint in some form available. I know a lot of degrowth movements have been working with municipalities and even states with ideas for and there was just recently an article published that we are over threshold on most of the sort of numbers on how the planet is doing, and I think that kind of sensible stuff is very much needed. That's also actually part of what Robin talked about, throughput, environmental throughput. If you're talking about degrowth in that sense, that we have to lower, get our economy within the limits of our ecology, of course, that's sensible. But how to manage that? First of all, how to achieve that? And secondly, how to manage that? And by manage, I mean, what is the system that ensures, not just, calculates, hey, we're over threshold here, people should be doing something. But what's the actual mechanism for us in the future for making sure of that? First, achieving that and making sure of that. And I think the first part of it is that we have to find ways within capitalism, finding some sort of stable ground, finding, situation where we have the kind of, systems between rich and poor countries to transfer wealth, to transfer resources, to enable poor countries work better and in the global community, in a sense that they are not being ripped off by rich countries constantly, which has been the case for hundreds of years. And I think that's very achievable within capitalism. And as someone who is advocating for system change, I think the possibilities we have within our current system are oftentimes sort of undervalued. I think there's lots to be done within global capitalism today. The thing is that most of that good stuff requires that we start doing them in a way that, while we're doing that, we seriously are building a bridge to a completely new democratic economy. And I don't see that in a lot of the current degrowth discussion, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's one point that the degrowth people make that I think is very, very, valid. And when they point to the fact that, well, let's take a look, at what's happened with all this growth of GDP. And they point out that, well, over the past 40 or 50 years, the lion's share of the growth in the economy has gone to literally the top 1%, the income earners and wealthy people on the planet. So they make a very valid point to say that, well, the growth we've been having has been very environmentally destructive, leading us to the verge of cataclysmic climate change. And the beneficiaries of that have not been the mass of people whose living standards have stagnated, and certainly not the mass of people in the third world. So they're saying that kind of growth we can clearly do without. And of course, and what leftist would not agree with that? Of course, that kind of growth we can clearly do without. On the other hand, to tell people in, sub-Saharan Africa, or in poor countries around the world, you just have to accept the standard of living that you still have. That's your fate, because the planet doesn't allow for anything else. I think it's both untrue and it's politically disastrous. And I think that's where the degrowth movement, through really what I think is a logical error, it's just a logical error in categories. It's a failure to realize that growth of throughput, growth of environmental throughput is not it is not the same thing as growth in economic well-being. And that if you increase throughput efficiency as fast as you increase labor productivity, then you can increase economic well-being indefinitely, without putting further strain on the environment. Now, there are some things where you have to do better than that. We've already way over produced greenhouse gases. So in that area, you're going to have to increase throughput efficiency, with respect to greenhouse gases far faster than you increase labor productivity. So there's the other thing that I want to say is that when you first become environmentally aware, the instinctive reaction is, well, we just have to stop, we have to stop having a negative impact on the environment. And we have to stop using it. Well, no. First of all, we couldn't stop using it. You do need inputs from the natural environment. And second of all, we don't have to if we use it wisely. And that leads to sort of a change in one's understanding of what am I doing as an environmentalist? Am I literally just trying to stop humanity from having such a heavy imprint on the natural environment? Is that what my task is? Or is my task to basically figure out how is humanity going to sensibly interact with and engage with the environment? And I call this kicking this can down the road. There are different parts of the natural environment. We're going to run out of them, or we're going to overuse a sink capacity in the case of greenhouse gases, but not at the same speed. And so what we basically have to be getting smarter about is, well, what's the environmental problem that is most serious right now? And the answer is clearly greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to prioritize solving that problem. People will tell me, oh, well, to solve that problem, then we need electric cars. That's right. And we need a lot more electric cars. Oh, but an electric car requires a mineral and we're going to run out of that mineral. Well, yeah, but if you check, we would run out of that mineral when? Well, maybe 200 or 300 years from now. So what you have to do, essentially, you have to change your mentality from we're not going to do anything to the environment to we're going to be sensible about the fact that we're going to prioritize cutting back on our use of the things that we're running out fastest and substitute things that we are running out of slower. And I call that sort of a strategy of kicking the can down the road. And that sticks in the craw of most instinctive environmentalists. They don't like to hear that the job is to kick the can down the road. They'd like to hear, no, I want a solution. I want to solve the problem. There is no solution to the problem other than kicking the can down the road. And fortunately, if we did a sensible job of kicking the can down the road, we could go on far longer than the human species and planet Earth is going to actually survive in the solar system. So, I mean, but it is a different mentality about what we're about and what the strategy is. And in some ways, it's very, very uncomfortable for people who are coming to environmental awareness for the first time. It really is a sort of a mental hurdle that I think it's very important for us to get over, and it's not easy.
Yeah, this reminds me how oftentimes in events we've organized at Paricom Finland, I've recognized that people just don't like uncertainty. That, you know, when talking about system, and a lot of people who are critical of capitalism or critical of growth are the kind of people who, you know, come to this world and then they grow up and look around and see, you know, this is an imperfect world. What the fuck? All kinds of shit are happening. This shouldn't be this way. And then they look around for answers. And for example, come to our event on participatory economy, and they hope to find the pure answer, the silver bullet that, you know, this solves everything. And I've always refused, probably doing a lot of damage to how many members we could have in Finland. But I've always refused to, you know, say that, yeah, this is the solution. This is the best economic system. And instead I've said that there are no easy solutions. There are no silver bullets. This will be the kind of fight that will be always with us. Once we are a global civilization, just like Robin said, it's going to be, you know, managing this whole thing generation after generation and finding ways that work. And, you know, learning from the past, like we learned from centrally planned economies and Soviet Union and so on, that clearly didn't work. But we're learning constantly is that capitalism doesn't work. And then in the future, I hope with democratic planning, we see, you know, probably find thousands of ways it doesn't work, but that it still is better than the ones we had in the past. And that just doesn't make the people happy. It, you know, the people who are critical of current system want to find something, you know, that, you know, the Shangri-La. And I think it's changing attitude. And I think I'm sort of hopeful. I think climate change is the kind of, you know, shit hits the fan serious moment for you know, humanity to think this over and find a new way of you know, taking seriously our task as stewards of this planet. But we're not there yet, and it's going to take a time. And I think degrowth discussion is part of that. But I think it's very important to recognize that it requires, instead of just saying that, you know, making these kind of moral statements about, you know, is growth possible or isn't possible and so on. Instead, it requires talking about sort of the actual solutions.
Let me say something briefly about actual solutions. So we're not going to prevent climate change by overthrowing world capitalism in time to do it. So, well, how are we going to prevent climate change even while most of the world's economies continue to be capitalist? And one of the dilemmas has been that as any economist will tell you, as any environmental economist will tell you, the logical place you need to tackle this problem is at the international level. Because when we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, well, that benefits people in China, India, and every place else as much as it does people in the United States. So there's a problem that economists are acutely aware of. It's called the free rider problem. Mm-hmm. Every country is going to want other countries to reduce their emissions, but not reduce their own.
Right.
Well, we have been at the international negotiations since 1972. And, there's every reason to be very discouraged about how much progress has or has not been made. And that's a key thing. You're not going to solve this in the end without much more successful international negotiations about sharing the burden of reducing emissions. And there's clearly a problem that has arisen in the negotiations, which is, but not all countries are equally responsible for having put that greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. And some countries are just a lot wealthier and therefore can afford to pay a higher part of the cost than other countries that are dirt poor. So this has been the stumbling block, but there is progress on that front. It's not hopeless. And pitching in, to play a role for progressive-minded people, there is a place to pitch in and play a role about this is what has to happen, and it has to be done fairly and equitably, or it won't happen big enough. In the meantime, it's easier to sort of put together national programs like Green New Deals. And we've made some progress finally on that front. I mean, thanks to Joe Manchin, we got a much worse bill than the one that the Biden administration put out there in the beginning. We don't have anything nearly as exciting and good as what AOC and various people were talking about. But that's okay. It's on the agenda now. At least it's on the agenda. And I know from experience out here in Western states in the United States that even though it's much harder for state governments to pursue aggressive programs to reduce emissions, because here's the dilemma. If your state has a program to reduce emissions, and if that means it's more costly for a business to operate in your state than some other state, you have to fear that the businesses will leave Oregon or California or Washington and go to a place where the environmental state laws, are more lax and lenient. So it's a more difficult problem to solve at the local level. And yet we have made incredible progress in a whole number of states here in the United States, even in that difficult area. So the idea that it's hopeless in the present world environment, and that while capitalism persists, that it's absolutely hopeless, that we cannot prevent it simply isn't true. We do not. It's giving up prematurely. It's giving up when it's not necessary. Now, what's required is all hands on deck. And anything that gives somebody an excuse not to be all hands on deck drives me bananas. And a lot of what goes on out there in terms of degrowth and some other things essentially amounts to why it's pointless for me to participate in this difficult job of doing the hard work of getting environmental legislation moving and convincing my government to play a responsible role in international negotiations, whichever government that happens to be.
Yeah, this is a longer topic, but in the European Union, there has been promising steps in changing the EU legislation. Some of it has been pushed actually by the degrowth people, but mostly like environmental groups that are trying to limit the usage of natural resources. And there's a lot of hard questions around that, which actually might be an interesting topic for another episode, because they also are, I think, great examples on why we need a democratic economy. Because once you start managing resources and putting hard limits, and then you come to the question of, well, how do you allocate within those hard limits? And obviously capitalism doesn't work that well. Democratic economy is hanging around that discussion.
Yeah.
But it's a whole other thing.
Yeah. But the EU actually provides a very it's an excellent example. The EU took a look at Germany and Portugal and said it's ridiculous for us to expect Portugal, to limit greenhouse gas emissions as much as we would expect Germany. They said Germany's just a wealthier economy, so they're both responsible for having created the problem to a greater extent, and they have greater capacity and ability to contribute to solving the problem. So when the EU, this has been part of EU practice on this issue now for decades, that they do assign differential responsibility, for the EU's total commitment to different countries in the EU, depending on differential responsibility and capability. And that's exactly what we have to apply internationally as well. So we already have one example of where the solution, is being implemented and has been implemented.
Certainly a very big topic with lots of threads to be able to follow, and a very interesting discussion here that we've had on the matter. And also with some very difficult questions and work to follow. Actually, on a side note, it turns out that Robin and I are currently working on revising a computer program for simulating a democratically planned economy to actually look for its environmental impacts. We're actually right now, in fact, this week as we're recording, I'm writing the code of the program to do that. So we'll see how that unfolds. You have been listening to or watching PEP Talk, the Participatory Economy Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the democratic alternative to capitalism known as the participatory economy. To find out more, visit the website of the Participatory Economy Project at participatoryeconomy.org. There you can join an online forum for discussing the issues like those discussed in this episode involving the interactions of capitalism, degrowth, climate change, system change, and related matters, as well as join an online monthly newsletter where the Participatory Economy Project will share updates regarding its activities. On behalf of Antti in Helsinki and Robin in Portland, this is Mitchell in Chicago. Thank you very much for watching and or listening. Bye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangements.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered work, vested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory.economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.